are other predisposing characteristics for mass killing and genocide. They make it more likely that responsibility will be relinquished and leaders will be followed unquestionably. People who have always been led by strong authorities are often unable to stand on their own in difficult times. Their intense need for support, he writes, will incline them to give themselves over to a group and its leaders. Authority and obedience, of course, are key characteristics of Mormon culture generally, and often produce great good. The alacrity with which Latter-day Saints band together in responding to natural disasters today, for example, is legendary. But the kind of obedience I am addressing here is the very opposite of unity in well-doing. It is instead the tendency to cave in when someone pressures a person to do evil. This tendency is extremely widespread among human beings. Work begun decades ago by Stanley Milgram at Yale University, and repeated and refined many times since then, has shown that humans will often relinquish their freedom to resist evil by shifting the blame for their choices to someone in a real or apparent position of authority over them. This tendency definitely played a role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Please don't misunderstand me on this point. Some people might apply the term blind obedience in referring to this propensity of humans made famous by Milgram's research. But as Staub makes clear, and I will cite him on this point in a moment, there is in reality no such thing as blind obedience. Every person has both choice and accountability. Having described some of the common conditions and characteristics that frequently contribute to mass killings, and demonstrated that they existed in southern Utah in 1857, I would now like to discuss some of the events that often lead to mass killing and show how they apply in the case of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. For many who ponder the subject, the most difficult aspect of the massacre to comprehend is how otherwise basically good people could commit such a horrible crime. The answer, in part, is that no one started out to commit a massacre. Instead, people made one bad judgment after another, then attempted to cover up one crime with a greater one until they had committed mass murder. 18 years before the massacre, Joseph Smith taught that power can be properly wielded only upon the principles of righteousness. He warned against attempts to use power to cover wrongdoing, to gratify pride or ambition, or to exercise control or dominion upon the souls of the children of men in any degree of unrighteousness. Staub explained that misuse of power occurs along a slippery slope, or what he calls a continuum of destruction. Perpetrators make many small and great decisions as they progress along the continuum of destruction, he writes. He explains that extreme destructiveness is usually the last of many steps along the continuum. Staub describes how this happens. There is usually a progression of actions. Earlier, less harmful acts cause changes in individual perpetrators, bystanders, and the whole group that make more harmful acts possible. The victims are further devalued. The self-concept of the perpetrators changes and allows them to inflict greater harm for, quote, justifiable, close quote, reasons. Ultimately, there is a commitment to genocide or mass killing, or to ideological goals that require mass killing or genocide. The motivation and the psychological possibility, he writes, evolve gradually. I believe that's exactly what happened in September of 1857. Staub points out that one factor leading to mass killing is an exaggerated fear of the victims. He writes, fear of the victims, who are the designated enemy, is important. It may have a realistic component, but the victim's power or evil intentions are usually exaggerated. Although the fear is in part culturally and ideologically induced, it is also a defensive process whereby anxieties about life problems are projected onto a convenient target. Fear of an identifiable object is more bearable than unspecified anxieties. Anger, hostility, and hate that arise from frustration, threat, and attack of many kinds are focused on a culturally or ideologically selected scapegoat. Exaggerated fear played a significant part in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. When the immigrants passed through Cedar City in early September, brief and minor conflicts broke out between some of the immigrant men and local settlers. In a near contemporaneous journal account of the event, one citizen further north wrote, "The immigrants were acting mean, threatening the bishop's life." Later accounts also said that some of the immigrants had threatened to join with the incoming troops, then rumored to be entering the territory at any time, perhaps even through the mountains near Cedar City. Whatever intemperate words were uttered by a minority of the immigrants were probably just idle threats made at the heat of the moment. And Alexander Fancher, the leader of the immigrants, promptly rebuked the men who made them. But some people who heard the statements or heard about them chose to take them very seriously. With my 21st century hindsight, I personally believe that the immigrants posed no serious threat at all. But in the charged environment of 1857, as I have written elsewhere, Cedar City's leaders took the men at their word. Closely related to exaggerated fear of the victims is the displacement of hostility. According to Staub, threats and frustration give rise to hostility and the desire to harm others. The appropriate targets of this hostility are, of course, the people who cause the problems. He adds, but usually they cannot be identified. The hostility is therefore displaced and directed towards substitute targets. Shortly before the immigrants arrived in Cedar City, southern Utah militia leaders had been warned of a possible invasion through the mountains east of southern Utah's settlements. Though scouts were sent out, no troops could be found. Anxieties about the approaching army were projected onto the convenient, identifiable target of the immigrants. Another step along the continuum of destruction is the devaluation of the victims. Staub writes, harming and killing members of a group become possible when a feeling of responsibility for their welfare has been lost as a result of a profound devaluation by a society or by an ideology adopted by the society. As I mentioned earlier, many of the settlers of early southern Utah were suspicious of outsiders. This view was exacerbated by the approach of the Army in 1857. The oncoming troops were commonly referred to as the enemy. After tensions developed between some members of the immigrant company and settlers in southern Utah, they too were construed as enemies. I have repeatedly said that nothing any of the immigrants purportedly did or said came close to justifying their deaths. How then did comparatively small problems develop into mass killing? Staub explains, human beings have a tendency to divide the world into us and them. They use seemingly trivial information to create in-groups and out-groups, and then discriminate against members of the out-group. The evaluation of victims can move rapidly from discrimination to escalating violence. Yet another factor in mass killings is the existence of some kind of military organization to carry out the destruction. Staub writes that motivation for mistreating a group is not enough. The capacity to fulfill it must be present. A monolithic central party, a powerful military, and other organized groups loyal to the government are often necessary conditions. A machine of destruction has to be created. The Utah Territorial Militia was reorganized in April 1857 and then revitalized in southern Utah in August 1857. As with militia units throughout the United States, every male between the ages of 18 and 45 who was not otherwise exempted was required to be part of the military force. This militia system, authorized by Congress, originally had a good purpose and ultimately developed into the system that today we call the National Guard. But during the 1830s and 1840s,